Good evening, and a very, very warm welcome to the annual lecture of the Forgiveness Project. My name is Fatah, and I'm a documentary maker. Really delighted to have been asked to chair this evening. The Forgiveness Project, I think most of us know and love to some extent, and I'm really delighted to be part of this event where I hope we will get to know the Forgiveness Project and the kinds of stories, people and explorations that so vividly take us to a kind of edge, if you like, of human experience, and then how to communicate from those places to imagine what is possible as a human. So that's enough from me. I do want to just tell you about the structure of the evening, first of all. So we will first of all have a lecture from our founder, Marina Cantacuzino, and she'll I'm really delighted that Marina's giving this the 9th annual lecture. I've been to several, and tonight we're really going to see the spirit that shines through what brings us all here today. So thank you for that, and we'll come to that in a moment. After Marina's lecture, which should finish, forgive me, we started slightly late, 2 minutes late, so we'll finish the lecture probably around 7:55, and then I'm going to introduce our two main guests who've been brought together through restorative justice and those processes. Jacob Dunn on my left and Joan Scanfield on my right. I'm going to say a little bit more by way of introduction when we get to that part of the evening. We'll have a conversation among the platform for about 15 minutes or so. But if you've got any questions, comments, thoughts, reactions, emotions, things that you maybe have a significant response to in the lecture or where we're going with this conversation, please hold on to that. And I'll do my best to invite as many of those comments questions as possible. There's no such thing as an unacceptable question or emotion that's too difficult to start to explore. And what I mean by that will become clearer through the lecture. So we've got a bit of discussion among ourselves, lots of questions and comments. That will take us hopefully to about 8:45. We might, with your permission, go on to about 8:50, but we'll definitely stop by around then. And then you're very welcome. We really encourage you to stay on, continue the conversations. There's a bar, bookstore, and there are also the trustees and others from the Forgiveness Project who've done work which helps meet some of the experiences that we'll be exploring tonight. So if things come up for any individuals and you want to take that further, I want to talk some about it. I will ask people who have some experience in these areas to make themselves known, and we can make sure we continue to nurture that conversation in a healthy way after this. So, Marina.
Thank you.
Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. So, I'm going to start now with this quote. "It is the responsibility of the living to heal the dead." Now, these words were spoken to me once by Alexandra Asseli, who is a psychotherapist and a creator of the Garden of Forgiveness in Lebanon. Asseli has written extensively about how if we don't lay to rest old resentments, the past will haunt us. And she talks about the repetitive nature of conflict, about how conscious and unconscious grievances are received by each new generation through what she calls an ancestral bond. Such enduring grievance stories passed down from teachers to pupils, from parents to children, and through the media and through politicians, she believes can only be transcended through understanding, compassion and forgiveness. And I really took a lot from the conversation I had with Alexandra, and it reminded me of what the German philosopher and political theorist Hannah Arendt said, who she put it differently. She said the only possible redemption from the predicament of irreversibility is our capacity to forgive. They're both talking about the power of forgiveness to change the narrative and to move the story along, to turn the page when actually nothing else can. Because when the original perpetrators are long dead, and when justice is not possible, forgiveness, mercy, and pardoning may be the only strategy we have to help us reconcile with the past and prevent old wounds and historical resentments festering across generations. And in an event that we did a few years ago with Professor Duncan Morrow, he is a lecturer in politics at Ulster, and he's worked in reconciliation in Northern Ireland for 30 years. He was talking about the intractable nature of sectarian conflicts that have been going on for decades. And he meant intractable because there is a problem in apportioning blame to some conflicts. Whose story is the true story? Whose story is the good story? When did the conflict start? Who started it? And who deserves justice? So in the context of ethnic and sectarian violence, he warns about the limits of justice and says, justice is dependent on the existence of an authority seen as just. And when that's absent, or when opposing groups disagree as to who is the victim and who's the perpetrator, who then can bring justice. And because of this, Morrow talks, I think, intriguingly about the impossible and yet essential need for forgiveness in conflicts where truth and facts are so often unobtainable and where every side has its own story of victimisation. And because I always like to bring stories into it, this is Jude White. He's one of our storytellers. He's a Catholic from Northern Ireland. His mother was murdered outside the family home by Protestant paramilitaries during the Trouble. And Jude believes the only way to reconcile in Northern Ireland is to get to the truth. And the only way to get to the truth is to have a general amnesty for everyone on both sides, which would mean no one going to prison for what they did in the past. He believes this would create the conditions for accountability, where people would feel safe to talk. But he also knows it'll actually never happen, because most victims want the perpetrators to stand trial, even though a conviction under the Good Friday Agreement would probably mean a maximum sentence of 2 years. And he says somewhat despairingly that he knows a lot of people for whom the totality of their existence is the events that happened several decades ago. And he says most people don't ever forgive because they see it as stampeding on the memory of their loved ones. So we go back to this impossible and yet essential need for forgiveness. I think it's a real paradox for me, because it sums up this most fascinating and most enigmatic and most confusing and most contentious, but also, frequently transformative practice that we call forgiveness. So this evening, I'm just going to talk about the healing power of stories and how we can change beliefs and stories that dominate our minds and become embedded in our national psyche. But first, I think, just for those who don't know, and because it's the 15th anniversary this year of the Forgiveness Project, I just thought I'd do a little resume about how and why I started the charity, which was back in 2003, really. And it was this picture that was one of the motivators. It's a picture of Ali Abbas. I was working as a journalist and living in London, and it was in 2003, as I said. Ali was 12 years old, and it was the opening days of the Iraq War, and his haunted, traumatised eyes stared out from newspapers across the world. And Ali had lost both his arms and his entire family when a US missile attack had hit his home in Baghdad. For the record, I was against the invasion. I was convinced that the more you come down hard on people, the more they will regroup and re-emerge in a toughened and more resistant way. It made no sense to me. And the photograph, which I've cropped, horrified me, but it compelled me as a journalist to search out real stories from around the world, stories which focused on empathy, compassion and forgiveness, and which demonstrated peaceful solutions to conflict. It was a private project which I did in my spare time with a photographer called Brian Moody as we were travelling around with other work assignments. He did the photos and I did the interviews. And it was a project fueled by anger, and I was determined to find evidence that proved that retribution was not always the answer to harm. So in that year, we collected 26 stories, and that became the F-Word exhibition, which opened in January 2004 at the Oxo Gallery. Called the exhibition the F-Word because by now I understood what a provocative subject forgiveness was, that it cut public opinion right down the middle. There were those who were inspired by it deeply, but there were those who were also deeply affronted by it. The exhibition documented stories of forgiveness and reconciliation from victims who'd suffered at the hands of others, but also from perpetrators who had transformed their aggression into a force for peace. And nothing I'd written about ever before or done had attracted this kind of response. Interest came from all over the world, from people wanting to use the stories in their own peace activism. The exhibition seemed to tap into a very deep public need to find humanity in a world so full of hate. And because of this overwhelming interest, I founded the Forgiveness Project that works with story, that's real lived experience, as a tool for change, to promote understanding, build empathy, and help people break out of cycles of harm. It's important to add that the Forgiveness Project has always been a place of inquiry rather than persuasion. I've always believed in the value of creating a culture of forgiveness, which is very different from setting regulations about forgiveness. So 15 years on, we've collected many, many more stories. The F-Word exhibition has been in 14 countries, seen by nearly 80,000 people in venues as diverse as a prison in Minneapolis, a shopping centre in Sydney, a hospital on England's south coast, in the EU in Brussels, and in rural villages in Kenya to support non-violence during the elections. Other than the F-Word exhibition, we add to the discourse through writing, talking, putting on events like this. We have created online educational resources which teachers download into the classroom. And we've developed a prison programme called Restore, which is group-based story sharing restorative process that supports prisoners to change the narrative of their lives. Now, I couldn't really give a lecture for the Forgiveness Project without just saying a little bit about my feelings about forgiveness after 15 years, what I've learned. So it's always intrigued me that if you Google forgiveness, these are the images you get, which none of them actually do it really for me. I think they sort of show forgiveness to be magical, mystical, religious, which of course it can be all of those things, but I think it's also messy, complicated and worldly. And I've never wanted the stories that we've collected to simplify or sanctify forgiveness, and I don't want to present it as something, just for the mentally strong or the morally superior. I think if you make forgiveness a condition, or if you make it a duty, it can easily become a kind of tyranny. So the stories shared by the Forgiveness Project express the process of forgiveness differently. For some it's sudden, for others it takes decades. For some it emerges quietly from the depths of their being. For others it's prompted by a single event or meeting or encounter. And for some it's conditional, and for others it's unconditional. And just to illustrate these two different positions of conditional and unconditional, again a couple of stories. Father Michael Lapsis is one of the first stories I collected during that year. He lost both hands and one eye in a letter bomb sent by the security forces of the apartheid government in South Africa. And he says he can't forgive, but because he doesn't know who to forgive. No one ever came forward, no one was charged. And he said if they did come forward, they would have to earn his forgiveness. He says, since I'll never get my hands back and will therefore always need someone to help me, they should pay that person's wages, not as a condition of forgiveness, but as part of reparation and restitution. And then there's the late Eva Kor, to illustrate the other position, a survivor of Auschwitz, who was always trying to explain to her critics that she had finally come to forgive her Nazi persecutors, not because they deserve it, but because I deserve it. So for her, forgiving was an act of self-compassion, an act of self-healing, not dependent on remorse or apology or justice. So I think to forgive seems to involve the following. It's about reconciling, not with the person or people, but with what is painful inside you, what is unresolved. In other words, making peace with what you cannot change. It involves a refusal to demonize the other, a recognition perhaps of what the American poet Longfellow said. He said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would find in each person's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. And in friendships and intimate relationships, it's about giving up the presumption that people should behave as we expect and want them to. David Whyte, the poet-philosopher, said, all friendships of any length are based on continued mutual forgiveness. I've long thought forgiveness is really the oil of personal relationships. And in crimes which are unspeakable, I think it's good to see forgiveness not as forgiving the act, never, but about forgiving humanity, of which we're all part, for its fallibility and for failing. My favourite description of forgiveness is attributed to the author Mark Twain, who said, forgiveness is the fragrance that the violet sheds on the heel that has crushed it. I like it because it shows that forgiveness grows out of damage. Pain, if you think about it, is the great motivator to forgive. It shows that it's messy and it's also a potentially healing balm. So, the fact that forgiveness has multiple meanings makes it contentious and contested territory. This image, by the way, is from a book that I've written with Dr. Masih Noor called Forgiveness is Really Strange. Forgiveness is contentious because there are those who believe that the act of forgiving is about moral absolution, is therefore dangerous and demeaning. Professor Charles Griswold is an American academic who's written prolifically on forgiveness, and he believes that because forgiving is so often identified with closure and therapy, he says, when forgiveness becomes the public rallying cry played out on daytime television, soap operas, encouraged by civic and religious leaders and praised for far and wide for its power to heal, its slide into confusion and vulgarity is inevitable. So he's not exactly a fan, although he does believe strongly in conditional forgiveness. He says with unconditional forgiveness, it collapses forgiveness into either excusing or condoning because it requires nothing of the offender. So that's one position. At the Forgiveness Project, we don't take sides. We just like to show the stories. And we have stories which have both positions. It's certainly true that forgiveness can get a bad name. It seems too easy sometimes. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, warned against this. He said, warns against the dangers of forgiving too easily. He said, because if forgiveness is easy, it's as if the suffering doesn't really matter. So that I think there are times when forgiveness isn't helpful. It's not a helpful response right in the middle of a heated conflict, whether between nations or families, because at these times people are entirely focused on themselves, on winning or on survival. There may be a need, a real need, for a season of rage and resentment and even grief. The researcher and storyteller Brené Brown talked about anger in this respect. She said, anger is a soul-sucking lifetime companion, but it is also a great catalyst for two of the grittiest and truest forms of love, justice and equality. The only problem, it seems to me, with anger is when it endures. I think lasting anger corrodes, possibly, just as lasting hate corrupts. So there is a dark side to forgiveness. For instance, there is such a thing as premature forgiveness. This is Mary Johnson, and Mary Johnson talks about it after her only child was murdered. Inspired by her faith, she very quickly said she had forgiven Ashaya Israel, and it's Ashaya in the picture, the man sentenced and imprisoned for her son's murder. But she says, but I hadn't actually forgiven. The root of bitterness ran deep. Anger had set in, and I hated everyone. I remained like this for years, driving many people away. Premature forgiveness in the media can confuse and infuriate. When Dylan Roof walked into a Charleston church in America, murdering 9 African Americans, within days some family members were publicly talking of forgiveness. This gesture, well, it certainly inspired some people, but it also angered others and generated a vigorous debate. People were asking, does black forgiveness only serve to condone white violence? And sticking with the dark side, one study looked at domestic violence, showing that where forgiving an abusive partner took place, the violence was more likely to continue. And it doesn't seem surprising, perhaps, but I think also it's important to remember here what Desmond Tutu says. He points out that forgiving doesn't mean reconciling. He says that you can forgive and renew a relationship, or you can forgive and release one. So I want to turn now to why I chose to explore this subject of restoration and forgiveness through story. At the heart of the Forgiveness Project is the understanding that stories have the power to transform lives. My interest in story goes back to my career as a journalist. I knew that true stories allowed the reader to become invested in someone else's life and feel empathy. This picture, by the way, has been drawn by one of the female prisoners in our Restore programme. And it says, there's two sides to every story, so never judge a book by its cover. So stories spark conversation. They can ultimately create understanding between people. I think facts fade, whereas stories stick because they stimulate the imaginations. And they can therefore change minds. I came across this quote at one point, and it really summed up for me what the Forgiveness Project does. It says, a story told at the right moment in someone's life can shine a light sufficiently bright to illuminate the way ahead on the map of life. Therefore, being exposed to stories from people we might otherwise dismiss, or from people who are very different from us, helps us build empathy by challenging our expectations and encouraging greater tolerance. It is, after all, so much easier to empathise with people who are the same as us. I love what the German poet Rilke said as his antidote to this inward-looking, in-group empathy. He said, I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. So storytelling can be a very useful tool when reconciling hostile communities, because it allows people from opposite sides to understand that pain is the same wherever or whoever you are. And losing a child, for instance, is a universal pain. And it was this realization that gave birth to the extraordinary Israeli-Palestinian peace organization, the Parents Circle. And we have some stories from the Parents Circle. But since stories are so powerful, it's vital to recognize that they can harm as much as they can heal. They can fan the flames of prejudice. They can normalize hate, especially in our digital age where the internet has turbocharged abuse and where disinformation sets up deliberately to confuse. Our leaders sometimes seem to be using stories of division to manufacture a sense of fear, flood communities with threat. And I think this is extremely dangerous, as the human mind can easily be pushed to the dark side. A year before the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, I was in Rwanda, and I spoke to someone from the Kigali Genocide Memorial, who warned me that critical to the future of his country would be the stories that people chose to share to mark the approaching anniversary. And he was expressing a need to, yes, remember the brutality and pain, but also to highlight stories and memories that could be presented in a way that encouraged healing. And reconciliation, and which could illustrate how compassion could be born out of hate. And I think the words of Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who's the South African psychologist, author of A Human Being Died That Night, are really important here, because she says that if memory was kept alive just to cultivate old hatreds and resentments, it's likely then just to culminate in vengeance and a repetition of the violence. But she says, if memory is kept alive in order to transcend hateful emotions, then remembering can be healing. So the stories from Rwanda that we share, they don't minimise the horror of what happened, but they do showcase stories of how people have rebuilt their lives and sometimes reconciled. As the poet Ben Okri has said, stories are the secret reservoirs of values. Change the stories individuals and nations live by and tell themselves and you change the individuals and nations. And this is why I choose to call the stories that we work with restorative narratives. Restorative narratives are stories which help shift the focus from tragedy to recovery, for example, or from despair to finding meaning, from dehumanization to understanding. They're rooted in inquiry rather than persuasion. They don't necessarily end happily, but they touch on themes of survival and hope and growth. All the stories that Forgiveness Project shares are restorative narratives. Stories that heal, restore, and rehumanize, that offer hope. Because as John Burgess said, hope is a form of energy. And to quote him, he said, and very frequently that energy is strongest in circumstances that are very dark. So through stories we bear witness to other people's pain. As Marion Partington, who's one of our storytellers, has said, telling my story has not only helped me to reconcile with the agonizing pain of losing my sister, but also helped others become more open and vulnerable with their own unresolved pain. And she's seen this happen to audiences in prisons, schools and churches many times. And I've witnessed it happen with so many of our storytellers, one of whom once told me, telling my story has saved me from it. I often go back to Maya Angelou, who said, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you. Telling a restorative narrative can also be an act of reparation. Many of those who were formerly perpetrators who work with the Forgiveness Project have a yearning to tell others and to be, as the poet Rumi put it, a lamp or a lifeboat or a ladder. The role these former extremists and ex-offenders play in acting as a guide and a role model and creating a new narrative also reminds me of something from the Course of Miracles, which I've actually never read, but I do love this quote. The most sacred place on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love. And just one example, Assad Shaftari, who's one of our storytellers, and was formerly a commander in the Christian militia during the Lebanese War and responsible for deciding which prisoners should live and which should die. And Assad says, I would venture into the jaws of hell if my story could shift just one person's mind and move them away from violence. The media likes what it calls triumph over tragedy stories. But these kind of stories aren't actually always restorative because they're often simplified and sanitized. What the media is not good at is nuance and complexity. So there's a story that was in the Evening Standard, definitely, a few years ago, a British academic called Paul Kohler, who was beaten up in his home in London by burglars. The story was reported widely in the media, and Dr. Kohler later reflected about how the media had portrayed and used his story as a story about lawless Polish immigrants. He said, narratives were imposed on facts. The more I look at it, the more I see it as a form of storytelling. Journalists using the story to make their point. Some members of the press turned it into an anti-immigration story, but it's a story about thugs. And when he was asked if the attack had destroyed his faith in humanity, he said, no, it's restored my faith in humanity. People have come up out of the blue and been so kind. So in these statements, he does everything he can to transform and shift his story away from one that fuels hatred to one that focuses on humanity. So, what does it take to live in peace with those we fear or those who've hurt us? What does it take to restore relationships, or if that's impossible, to reconcile with our own unresolved pain? And from the many stories I've collected, it seems to me it requires 4 fundamental human qualities to get to a place where you can let go of resentment and possibly forgive. So I'm going to conclude the lecture by introducing these 4 qualities and using one example from the storytellers in the Forgiveness Project. And the first quality that I thought I could see everywhere was curiosity. It's a vital ingredient of forgiving because it fuels an inquiring, open mind as you move from why me to why them. Wonder and imagination keep us from behaving as if we have everyone figured out. And the example I've chosen is Linda Beale, again one of the early stories I collected. And she's standing in the middle there with two of the men who killed her daughter. Amy Beale, in 1993, was a Fulbright scholar working in South Africa against apartheid when she was beaten and stabbed to death in a black township in Cape Town. And the four youths convicted of her murder were granted amnesty by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after serving 5 years of their sentence. A decision which was supported by Amy's parents. And a year later, Amy's parents went even further and decided they wanted to meet the killers themselves. And Linda says, we wanted to meet them. It wasn't about pity or blame, but about understanding. And as a result, she went on to meet Izzy and Tobacco, who are in the photo. And they built a close relationship with the Beales. And they were given jobs at the Amy Beale Foundation Trust in Cape Town, which was an organisation set up in memory of their daughter. And this extraordinary turn of events happened because the Beales started out with curiosity. They couldn't help but wonder what conditions might lead a black youth in South Africa seeing a young white woman's life as so worthless. The second thing I identified was perspective. With curiosity, we develop a larger perspective and worldview. Research shows that people prone to forgive are more flexible in their thinking, less black and white in their expectation of how life or other people should be. And I like this story of Carsten Mathiasen because it's easier, I think, for people to relate to in the sense that it involves relationships, heartbreak and anger. Many years ago, when his children were young, Carsten's wife announced she was leaving him for another man. Sorrow soon turned to anger, and Carsten was consumed by intense revenge. He would ring and shout down the phone at his rival, Torben, threatening violence. He felt tormented and obsessed, until eventually, one day, prompted by his daughter's unhappiness and the knowledge the family would inevitably become split in two, which he didn't want, he decided to make a pretty brave step, I think. And he reached out to Torben. He phoned him up and suggested they meet for coffee. So they did in a Copenhagen cafe. And Carsten sort of describes who he saw coming through the door. He said he was handsome, he was a friendly-looking guy, gypsy-like appearance, which he said I immediately warmed to. And he said, I knew from that moment on we would become friends. And they did, for a long time, for years, until Torben got ill with terminal cancer. And Carsten was there for him and visited him during those last days. And of that time, he says, when Torben went out of my world, I cried the way I did when he came into it. And I think that's a true example of this dramatic shift of perspective, transforming feelings of blame and punishment to compassion and forgiveness through taking this restorative action, you could call it. And then, of course, there's empathy. If curiosity leads to understanding, which is all still quite head-based, then understanding leads to empathy, which is heartfelt. Empathy requires you to stand in someone else's shoes, no matter how dirty or ill-fitting those shoes may be. So often it is a moment of empathy that shifts the narrative away from hate. And this is Grace Adawu, another of our storytellers who's worked in the prisons with us. And she lives in London, and in 2008, her adored 14-year-old middle son David was murdered in a random attack by an older boy from another school. The killer, Elijah, was charged with murder, sentenced and in prison. And for a long time, Grace felt nothing but rage and total despair. And then one day, she decided she just had to meet Elijah, or try to ask why, in order to unlock her capsizing grief. So a meeting was arranged. She went to the prison where Elijah was serving his sentence. She was very nervous. When she arrived, she was told that Elijah had been crying all night and that the meeting very nearly had been called off. But it wasn't, and she went into the room and she saw him slumped over, not able to look her in the eyes. And the prison chaplain and a prison officer were there too. And somewhere into the conversation, she asked Elijah why he had killed her son. And he said that he'd done it because David, her son, was from a rival school, and because he, Elijah, happened to have a knife in his pocket that day. And when Grace heard this, she broke down. And she told me for the first time ever, she cried in front of strangers. And then she said, when I recovered myself, I told Elijah, I'm not crying for David, I'm crying for you. What have you done with your life? And I think this is a true moment of empathy, which led to Grace and her family being finally able to find some peace. Grace asked Elijah to write to her sons, explaining what had happened, and her husband, who's behind in the picture, by the way, and expressing his remorse in order to help break the cycle of hate. And the fourth thing, I don't know if it's a quality really, but it's what I identified, was this thing called meaning making, this ability to use adversity for a greater good. And when I was travelling for my Winston Churchill Travelling Fellowship, I met an amazing woman called Dr. Marilyn Armour from the University of Texas, who'd done a lot of work into complicated bereavement. And that is bereavement after homicide, where recurrent death images and a shattered worldview persist. And she discovered that the bereaved were able to make meaning out of their loss. Or rather, she discovered that when the bereaved were able to make meaning out of their loss, then they were able to deal with their loss better. And she explained that this isn't about making sense or finding benefit in the brutality of murder, but rather about what she called the intense pursuit of what matters. In other words, when survivors pursue what matters to them, they are able to find meaning in their life again. This might be like starting a campaign group, a peace organisation, helping others in some way. And the useful byproduct of this is that people then start to develop new ways of belonging to society. So I was really excited when I heard this, because it was exactly what I'd seen in all the forgiveness stories I collected. The healing process, it seems, is to pass from the narration of an offence as hurt feelings to a narration of an offence as an experience of significance. And the last story I'm sharing with you is that of Pardeep Kaleka, whose father was one of 6 people murdered in a mass shooting at a Sikh temple in Wisconsin in 2012 by a white supremacist. In the wake of his father's murder, Pardeep has become a powerful voice against racism and violence. And this came about through him meeting another of our storytellers, the former white supremacist Arno Michaelis, who belonged actually to the same group at one point. And Pardeep and Arno have built an organisation called Serve to Unite, which works in schools with children of all ethnicities to encourage them to cherish each other as human beings and to identify as peacemakers. And Pardeep was motivated to take this path to work with Arno, partly out of his faith, Sikhism, where there is a saying, we move in relentless optimism, but also because part of his recovery was this innate need to make sense out of what had happened. And he says, we understood the how, not the why. Until you understand the why, you can't make meaning. And making meaning heals and allows people to reconnect with humanity. So, to conclude, it was the division and polarisation of 2004 in the aftermath of the Iraq War that gave rise to the Forgiveness Project. And 15 years on, I think, and you probably will agree, that the violent rhetoric and intimidation seems worse than ever. Too often encouraged by politicians and media commentators, it's really quite common now to witness or hear about instances of hate in the streets or the shops, public transport, even on NHS wards. We're living in a time where us versus them rhetoric increasingly clouds complex issues, where the anonymity of the internet can turn the decent citizen into a monster, and where whole groups can be dismissed and dehumanised in a single tweet. So the Forgiveness Project's core purpose in this climate is to nudge this ugly narrative of our time towards humanising stories and away from stories of hate, insularity and xenophobia. Something has to break the cycle. And I just really wanted to finish where I started. When Alexandra Assaili, who's the creator of the Garden of Forgiveness in Lebanon, told me that through forgiveness, it was the responsibility of living to heal the dead. She was actually quoting the Jungian psychoanalyst Roger Woolger, who said, "It is the responsibility of the living to heal the dead. Otherwise, their unfinished business will continue to play out in our fears, phobias, and illnesses." And I think the responsibility rests with all of us, not just in the stories we choose to tell, or the language or labelling we use, but also in a commitment, I believe, to look internally at that which is unreconciled. Because, as the spiritual teacher Richard Rohr has said, if we do not transform our pain, we will most assuredly transmit it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marina. The first of these annual lectures started 9 years ago. It was given by Desmond Tutu, and I think that the way that you have helped curate these stories, identify them, put them into the culture, against the grain of you're a journalist by background, you will know well how the media of its nature polarizes and wants to give simple headlines, and you've insisted on taking those skills and turning them outwards to something else. So thank you very much for that, and also making clearer to us the journey that you've taken in the first 15 years of the Forgiveness Project. And we'll be hearing more of Marina's insights into the nature of storytelling. I want to move now to our guests. Jacob Dunn and Joan Schofield. You were brought together through a restorative justice process, and from opposite ends, as it were, of a tragedy, we come to this conversation now. And I just wanted to start, because not everybody will know about the circumstances that bring you two to be connected so deeply now. Could I invite you first, Joan, to just say briefly what happened?
My son, James Hodgkinson, went up to the cricket in Nottingham. After the cricket, they went on a bit of a tour of the pubs. They went into Yates Bar, as I believed it, met with a group of other friends. James was with a group of friends. They were chatting and messing about in the pub. This carried on outside the pub. As I believe Jacob had a message to say that, there was something going on in the city centre. He went along to see his friends and believed that my son was a threat to his friends and punched him, in which James fell to the ground and banged his head. He was then taken to Queen's Medical Centre, where he was 9 days in intensive care, which was a roller coaster of, will he need rehab and live, or will he tragically die? And obviously, he died. And it turned then from GBH to homicide, and the police looked for who'd done it.
We're going to explore something of the journey of the relationship between the both of you, but maybe, Jacob, thanks for being here. Do you just want to say something about what your experience was that evening?
Yeah, well, tragically, I acted on impulse. I acted on what I had been taught to believe, and didn't have the curiosity, which you alluded to, Marina, to ask why my friends were starting a fight, to ask why there was a confrontation, and instead again, I acted on impulse and thought that the right thing to do was to protect my friends. Although that sounds stupid, going around punching people isn't being a good friend, and you always run the risk of causing harm to people, and tragically, on that night, what happened.
Okay, thank you both for summarising and condensing a series of life-changing experiences for both of you. I think with the help of Marina's lecture, can I bring us to the journey of this connection? So this was back in 2011 that happened. It turned into a homicide. The police came to charge you. You went through a judicial process. Can we move to where you were in your mind and your heart in the court when you were looking for justice, trying to come to terms with something no parent wants to imagine?
The police are telling you the maximum Jacob was going to get. He was going to be in for years. That sounds like it's going to be justice. But no years will take the pain. Jacob was then going to be in for 14 months. Where's the justice in 14 months for my son's life?
So just to be clear, the prosecution barrister came to see you.
Oh,
and he explained what he was going to try and do to minimise your sentence, but the result of all that was prosecution and a sentence of 14 months.
Well, they gave Jacob 4 years, and then they took a year off because he'd pleaded guilty, so we hadn't had to have the trial. They took time off because he was under 21, and I think that ended up to be 30 months and 14 of it inside. But at that time was the London riots. People were getting a longer sentence for stealing a television. And I was told, but they intended to steal the television. Jacobs wasn't with intent. And how can you justify that in your mind?
Right. So that's where you were with that experience. It was unacceptable.
It was unacceptable.
As it were, a tariff was being put on your son's life, which was very short.
So Jacob had killed him, but the country had stood by Jacob, in my eyes, at that point.
Right.
I was being punished more than Jacob was at that point.
We'll come to you in a moment. So you talked to me about the bitterness that you felt at that time.
I felt very bitter about that. We appealed. We wrote to different MPs. We campaigned. I felt very bitter.
And meantime, for you, Jacob, you were feeling...
I was feeling bitter. I was feeling as if I was the one that was unfortunate. And found it difficult to even consider anybody else's feelings or the impact that my crime would have had on anybody else, because I was just so consumed in my own self-pity, I guess, in my own. I was just in a pretty bad place, and I didn't have the skills at the time to even consider thinking about anybody else, because I didn't really at that time understand the impact that it was going to have on me or my own family. And so, yeah, I was in quite a selfish place back then, feeling like I was the one who was hard done by, because how could I ever truly understand the harm that had been caused to Joan and their family.
And that continued through your sentence to a period of probation.
Yeah.
After. So then what started to shift? Because communication began by 2013?
Yeah. So when I was in custody, I became more angry and more resentful of the situation that I'd found myself in. I felt hopeless. I felt like I had nothing to give, and I had failed, basically. And then I was released from custody, as many young people are more likely to commit further crime than they were when they went in. And thankfully for me, I went to go and see my probation officer 2 months after being released. And they told me that Joan and David wanted to speak to me and ask me some questions. And just that single act alone was enough for me to, was enough to strip me of my self-righteousness, was enough to strip me of it taught me empathy within a second. You know, the courage that Joan showed in being able to have that curiosity to ask me those really tough questions just took me back. And immediately I started to feel empathy. Immediately I started to realize that there were people in this situation who had been suffering more than I was.
Okay, and why did you decide you wanted to communicate with Jacob? What were you looking for?
For questions about the night, why he thought he'd done it. Was there a reason, James? There was, a big group of lads. Was there any reasons why? And mainly, now he was out, what was he going to do with his life? Was it going to carry on the spiral it was on? And
so at that time, would you have imagined you would be sitting here talking about this? Now, so tell us a bit about that. Where were you at emotionally, psychologically?
well, I was still bitter about the sentence. I was devastated with my loss. You're trying to deal with other family members. You're trying to deal with the situation.
Other family members who maybe
My
want to
parents,
understand why.
yeah.
Why do you want to have this conversation?
Yeah, why do I want to communicate with this boy? So letters were going backwards and forwards. And you didn't just get letters. Mediation would come and tell you when he answered this question, he looked really upset. Or so you got some sort of feeling of what type of person Jacob was. It wasn't just he said this or he said that.
Right. So through the mediation, we're starting to hear about each other's responses.
Yes.
2013. So we go forward to 2015 when you first met. Is that
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So we've already been on a journey, emotional, psychological, spiritual even, for 4 years. Each of you being true to the darkness of that as much as now the beginnings of what it might be like to come into relationship to each other. So then take us to that day when you two first met.
So Jacob had a lot longer journey than I did. So I was driven by victim support, and I already knew that Jacob was on the way. So he'd made the first very big step to get in the car to come. I arrived at the building knowing that he was already there, but he still had to make a big step to come and see me. And I felt he was a bigger person to walk into the room where I was.
You felt he was a bigger person
Yes.
than you. Tell us about that.
Because I just felt he was coming to say sorry to me, and he must have had tremendous courage and be a very, brave person to come into a room and say sorry I'm the person that killed your son.
And you remember feeling that at the time?
Yes.
And for me, it was the opposite. So I obviously thought and was extremely grateful that Joan had the courage to do what she was doing, because I felt like she was the one that provoked me to save myself. And I'll always be forever grateful for that.
I've got in my mind photographs of your wonderful son, James, and how in a way you're being true to his spirit in following this journey. Do you want to say something about that?
James's nature was very caring. He was a paramedic. He was a volunteer for underprivileged children here in London. And I think he would be very proud of how Jacob has turned his life around. And I am, too. I think it's taken a lot of courage for him to do it.
And how important is it for you to be encouraged by James's mum?
Massive. I still have to pinch myself to believe that it's even true. That the person who I've harmed the most is the one who has judged me the least and supported me the most. Well, so it's a kind of surreal situation to kind of find yourself in.
You've put me in mind of something my mother told me before she died, which is when someone's at their most unlovable, that's when they need your love. And it seems to me when you both walked into that room from different angles, you were finding something much bigger than your pain. I'm thinking a little bit of your lecture, Marina, and the cautions that some of the storytellers give not to, what's the word, sort of leapfrog one's pain into some idealised, even romanticised notion of forgiveness. That this is a journey 4 years already before your meeting, walking through significant suffering. Sometimes people use the word unforgivable, that's unforgivable. And it seems to me that, maybe we all use that, and hopefully most of us won't be to have to live through the extremes that you're living through. But lots of people say, I can think of myself sometimes thinking to myself, that's unforgivable. But your stories begin at the limits of that. That actually, what does that word unforgivable mean? Is that a kind of closing down of my humanity, and are you offering doors into something bigger, but by being true to the pain and the suffering and the loss?
Yeah, and it's a funny word, forgiveness. I'm trying to forgive myself. And at the same time, early on in our journey, I didn't want to depend on forgiveness in order to change either.
Can you say what you mean by that? You didn't want to depend on forgiveness to change?
Yeah, because I had to sit there and listen to everything that, 4 years worth of correspondence and everything that Joan had to go through. And whether or not, I made a decision that whether or not she was going to forgive me or not, I was going to make sure I changed. And so I didn't want to have to depend on Joan to forgive me. in order to change, because that would just be selfish of me.
And from the opposite end, as it were, did you need, you came into that room looking for answers.
Yes. And they said that you could be in a room just 2 or 3 minutes together, or you could be in there longer. You've got the room for as long as it takes. And we were in there about an hour and a half.
And at the end, we were having a laugh and drinking tea and biscuits, so that was a bit of a... I didn't expect that when I went in there, but...
It's a really beautiful moment that you've got to in this relationship, but also I'm bearing in mind things that either you've told me or I've heard in things that you've said publicly before, and that's, I'll summarise it, these aren't your words, but that forgiveness is jagged, that there are days when, yes, I can do it, but it's a process, it's not something, a decision that you then have to kind of live by. Is there anything you want to say about how to humanise that journey? Are there days when it's not possible to sit as you are today?
Oh yeah, there's days when, quite frankly, it's shit. And you can't see a way through it. And there's other days where you feel incredibly privileged and lucky to have been given the opportunity that you have.
And also, for me, the tables have turned in that I was so bitter about the 14 months. And now, if he hadn't have had 14 months, we might never be here today. If he'd have had longer, this might never have happened. So restorative justice has everything to us.
We could continue if I'd like to, as you can tell. But I want to make the most of Marina being here and our audience just to reflect on something you are asking us to think more deeply about, Marina, which is the last things that they've both been saying. It seems to me that how they frame the story, how we frame the story of our experience really invents, creates what our future is. Is there anything else you want to say about the nature of storytelling in this?
Well, I think it's interesting that restorative justice is, to me, a form of storytelling, because both in that 1.5, both, I'm imagining, were given time to speak and to share their stories and to look at what happened, why did it happen, how did you feel when it happened. And although it doesn't mean that there wasn't anger in the room, if it's done well, restorative justice is immensely powerful. It can build empathy, it can create connection, it can help people overcome differences and defences. And I think in a way it can sort of end up in almost like a shared narrative where a commitment is made together to find a solution, to make amends. And I know that's what happened, and I know that Jacob talked about going on to studying, and I know that was really important to you. So it's a restorative, active thing that involves story, and I think it's really important that the victim can, sometimes it's the first time they'll be heard, they'll be witnessed, they'll be finding a voice, it'll be cathartic, and I think for the offender, it's cathartic as well, but it's also very often, it's not about asking for forgiveness, because restorative justice isn't about forgiveness, but it's about taking responsibility. And this is hugely healing for victims to see the offender take responsibility. But yeah, it's all about storytelling, restorative justice, I think.
The 4 kind of pillars, if you like, that you left us with in the end of your lecture, that felt to me like creating the conditions in which such a thing as forgiveness might arise. And you contrasted that in your lecture with sometimes there can be a view from the outside that someone should forgive, or even that a whole society should forgive something. And that pressure in itself can be not just unhealthy, but can be very damaging. And you both seem to find your way towards what we might call forgiveness, but through an authentic journey with how difficult that is, and the bare facts of what happened. We're kind of scheduled to have a bit more chat, but I'm really interested to respond and include as many perspectives as we can from the audience tonight. So if, with your permission, I would ask if we could have the lights up a little bit more. And if anyone's got questions or comments, yes, I'll be... Yeah, if you can hang on while a mic comes. Oh, I should have said at the beginning, I just pointed out that there are notes up saying that this event is being recorded. If anybody wants to speak or contribute and would prefer not to be recorded, that's absolutely fine, but would you just let me know that, and we'll make sure that that doesn't form part of the record of this evening. Yes, so first question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you all very much for being here tonight and for telling your stories. And it was a fantastic lecture, Marina. This is just an inquiry to both Joan and Jacob. Was there anything from your friends or family on either side that particularly illustrated and gave strength to your purpose in pursuing your restorative justice together? You can say no, but just, was there any reflections between people besides the direct connection, people you spoke to that thought, now I see why I'm doing this?
Yeah, because when, as you say, restorative justice is all about stories and sharing narratives, I had no experience of death, never mind bereavement or loss up until that point. And so although I was deeply impacted by what I'd heard from Joan, there was still a little bit of a lacking of understanding. But I wanted to work on that, and I wanted to make sure I didn't forget that. So as I took that forward with me, and and that was what motivated me in those initial periods. But then, sadly, we all are guaranteed to experience loss and bereavement. And so, you know, tragically, a series of people close to me started to pass away. And that was the first kind of moment in my story where I was like, oh, now I have a slight inclination of the pain that Joan and others are feeling as a consequence of my actions. And so I started to kind of, I think that kind of alludes to kind of what you were asking. And then later on, more recently, I've had children. So that then added another layer of kind of understanding and appreciation for Joan and the courage that she's been able to show. So I guess life events, as long as you remember the lessons, can reinforce and support me, have helped and supported me going forward. Even though those future lessons were at times obstacles that could have set me back, I was able to frame them from the conversations that we'd had in a way that actually supported me and helped me build that resilience to get through other things as well.
The question's also, I think, if I caught you right, about how the family or the immediate circle around you respond to this kind of journey. And I'm recalling the responses of Jo Berry. Jo Berry, her father, was killed in the Brighton bombing in 1984, and she decided she wanted to meet Pat McGee, one of the bombers who was already in prison but was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. And she describes, that's an extraordinary journey which the Forgiveness Project has been working with as well. But one of the things that Jo really emphasised was that in her immediate circle, family, friends, some very senior Conservative politicians, they absolutely could not understand what on earth she was doing. Why would she do this? And that I've heard that kind of report from various people, and I think the very singular journeys you've had, sometimes one almost has to go against the current of the protection of family, which is completely understandable. and friends and find your own way through. Is that something you recognise?
I think family don't understand why I'm here tonight. But they haven't been on the same journey as I've been on. Whether it's, my other son or my sister or whatever, they all say good luck. I hope you're doing what you want to do, but they don't really understand. And unless you're in my shoes, you wouldn't understand. And it isn't a journey I chose to do. And obviously when I lost James, I never envisioned we'd be doing this.
Yep.
But I'm glad we are doing it.
Right. And people find their own journeys. I did some work with Steve Biko, Black consciousness leader, murdered in police custody in South Africa, and I was working with his son, Nkosi Biko, who was opposing Desmond Tutu, in fact took Desmond Tutu to court, saying that the whole Truth and Reconciliation process denied him and his family justice. And he spoke from the position of wanting to be true to his father's memory in naming what had happened. And I say that because if anyone feels that they're under pressure, as it were, to forgive in a particular way, that isn't quite the territory we're in. But I think that what the kind of garden that Marina's been nurturing is one which tries to be true to the different ways in which people can grow and change and be challenged according to what's true in their experience. Sorry, enough for me. But, can I just see, how many people have got questions before I come to you? Okay, there are quite a few. Time's short, so what I'm going to do is collect 2 or 3 comments or questions and then ask people to respond. So I can't see where the mics are at the moment. So there's a lady. Okay, why don't we go here first? Thank you.
Thank you. The question really for Jacob and Joan. Thanks for sharing your story, which must have been very difficult. Based on your experience, how would you like to see changes in our justice system and in particular in the prison service? How could these things, what can we learn from this? How far have we got with it? And what would you both like to see changed?
Okay, so I'm just going to hold that. We're going to collect 2 or 3 questions and then invite some of us. Oh, thank you. Yes, the lady here.
I'm extremely moved by the conversation that you have facilitated there, Dr. Rugani, between Jacob and Joan. And I want to thank you for being willing to have that conversation before us. It's incredible that you have been able to do that. So thank you. And it was something that Jacob mentioned. You mentioned self-forgiveness, and that was a journey that you were on. And it's something that it's for various reasons I don't need to go into, something I'm very, very interested in. And my question is your journey to self-forgiveness in any way connected to being forgiven by Joan? Or is it something completely separate and different?
Thank you. And another huge question. I'm going to take one more and then see how we can respond to some of this. So the gentleman... Sorry, is the mic already gone somewhere? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is my first experience of the Forgiveness Project, and I like the sound of restorative justice, but I don't really know exactly what that is. And I think that could be a common theme in the questions that have been asked thus far. So if you could perhaps touch on that in the answers that are given to the other questions and actually outline what exactly restorative justice is, I would appreciate that.
Thank you so much for those 3 questions. So what I suggest is we take the first and third first. So there's something about what any of these individual experiences might mean for policy, and either of you want to... What is restorative justice? What are we talking about here?
I think for me, restorative justice is bringing people who have had some sort of issue. It doesn't have to be a criminal justice issue or a specific crime. It could be a civic dispute, it could be whatever it is. It's just being able to facilitate a conversation between those two bereaved parties in a way that allows everyone to be heard equally, and that has an emphasis on moving forward in a positive way. And it has to be mutually agreed to. There's no, it's not really truly restorative justice if people are forced into it. And I'll let you add.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of add what President Trump tried to do with Harry Dunn's parents was a sort of form of restorative justice, bringing an offender and a victim together and having a dialogue and a conversation. And it is used a lot in this country, and it's used through the criminal justice system. Sometimes police do it. People are trained, and has to be, preparation is absolutely key. It's used alongside the criminal justice system. It's had a lot of research done to it, and it reduces recidivism. It has huge victim satisfaction, and it is an incredibly powerful process. It's probably expensive because training people and everything. I think it should be used much more widely than it is.
While you've got the mic, I mean, do you want to say something about the Forgiveness Project and the work in restorative
Well,
processes?
we don't do restorative justice, but we share restorative justice stories. So actually, a very good way to learn more about it would be to go onto our website and Google restorative. Put in the search restorative justice, and there are many stories like Jones and Jacobs. But we share restorative narratives more than do the actual conferences, they're called, which is the meeting.
So the overwhelming experiences of people in your situation is you don't get to meet beyond maybe seeing each other in a courtroom. But this opportunity came. Do you want to say what restorative justice meant?
Victim support.
Yeah.
After quite a while of me going on about, I wonder what Jacob's up to in prison, and hitting barriers that we didn't know really what type of person Jacob was. Was he doing anything in prison to improve himself? How was he feeling about what he'd done? Everything was shut. We weren't allowed to ask anything. He was protected. And all these questions kept coming over with the conversations with victim supports. In the end, he then said, you could try restorative justice, but Jacob's got nothing to gain from restorative justice. And so he might not be willing to participate, but we took the chance and put it forward. But is also a bit of a postcode lottery to whether your police want to facilitate restorative justice.
Maybe that takes us to this first question, which is more about policy, or how you might like to see any structural change based on these very hard-won insights.
Well, for me personally, I feel that restorative justice has done everything for us. I haven't got the anginess of the sentencing anymore, because we've done more with restorative justice in ourselves than the prison ever would have done. And if we hadn't have had restorative justice, I would still be in a dark place, not knowing truly what happened on the night, how Jacob felt about it, what was he doing now. And I don't know how Jacob would be today if we hadn't have done it.
Thank you. Can we go to the second question? You've had a bit of a chance.
Can I comment on the
yes, please
first
do.
question?
Yeah.
I don't really want to go into the criminal justice policy too much, because I've just finished a degree in criminology, so I just kind of want to put the books down.
Actually, it's worth a bit more applause than that, because you got first, didn't you?
Yeah.
You just graduated. Very well done.
I think a starting point would be for people to have more conversations like this. Marina, you mentioned in your lecture quite a lot about how narratives pass through generations, and I think more of us need to have a deeper conversation around what is punishment, what is justice, because we're all kind of just taught that people go to prison when they do something wrong, and that makes everything better. But when you ask victims of crime, when you look at the reoffending rates, this approach that we've adopted since the mid-70s has just led to more and more people in prison, overcrowding population, more suicides, more victims of crime, more people resenting each other, more of the kind of divisive us versus them culture. And so the simplest answer I could give would be to take the politics out of criminal justice reform. I wouldn't even have a justice minister. I'd say, look, you politicians have had the opportunity for decades to try and resolve the crisis of the prison estate and failed miserably. Let the people making policy be the professionals working on the ground and be evidence-led instead of emotionally-led, driven policy. So.
More questions.
What would you, just listening to that and you were nodding and agreeing, what would you say to yourself 3 or 4 years ago thinking 14 months, it's a disgrace?
Yes, back then, I still believed the 14 months at that time was a disgrace, but obviously our journey has changed that. Our journey has changed that. If now, looking at it, if Jacob had been inside longer, we might never have got to this.
What would you say to your younger self then to help her understand? It's a funny question,
Yeah.
isn't it? But I'm struck by how effectively, quickly, authentically you've moved from the completely understandable bitterness of the terrible loss that your family has suffered to where you are now. And I'm thinking, what the journeys that you've both been on, how do you encourage that movement, that journey in yourself and in others? What do you say or do?
Because let the bitterness go and
How do
finding
you do that?
forgiveness.
What does that mean? Let the bitterness go and find the forgiveness. How on earth have you done that?
It's courage, and it's just time as well. Time and working on it, talking to people, therapy.
Maybe that takes us to the second question, which is about forgiving oneself.
Yeah, I don't want to, I hope I haven't suggested that I've completely forgiven myself, because again, it's a constant journey. I might feel like I have 1 month and the next I feel a bit down about it, but what I tell myself is that's okay. That's normal to have all these mixed emotions, and I want to be able to feel all those different emotions because it helps me to remember and process those emotions. Will I ever get there? Who knows? But yeah, it's a difficult question. But I know earlier on I mentioned that I didn't want to rely on being forgiven in order to change, and that's something that I do stand by. I almost feel like forgiving myself would be a bonus if I get there. But for now, I just want to make sure that I learn from my mistakes and do whatever I can to move forward in the best way possible out of the circumstances. And if I can try and do that, I can hopefully sleep well at night.
And when you hear Joan, Mum, saying that you were the bigger person in the room, what's that like?
Well, really, I just want to say, no, you were. But, but I don't really want to be playing the blame game. So, yeah, it's just...
It's a gift, isn't it?
It's a gift, yeah. That's the best way to describe it.
Yeah. Can I check with you? We'd thought we'd finish at 8:45. It looks to me like a few more people have got questions and comments. Can we go on to 8:50 and wrap it up then? Are we happy to do that? Or shall I chair us to 8:40? Can we go? I'm going to... Any improvements on 8:55? I hear 8:55. So I'm going to take kind of silence as assent. I'll go on to 8:50 just to collect a few more voices. Is that okay? Lovely. So a couple of hands at the back. Or is the microphone with anyone at the moment? I can't see. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Yes, please go ahead.
Hello, hi.
Hi.
My name's Jill Hill. I work in restorative justice in Lincolnshire. One of the sort of the unique things about restorative justice is that you're working with the victim and you're working with the offender as well. But other sort of professional services become quite sort of protective over their victims and their offenders. And I just wondered what your experiences of that was.
Thank you. And then gentleman behind you in the white short sleeve shirt.
Hi, thanks ever so much for sharing so bravely, both of you. A question for Jacob. You mentioned about the conditioning that you had about stepping in to protect your friend and doing something that harmed deeply another person. I feel like that there's a gap, there's a moment of silence between reaction or action that can change things for the whole of society. And I'm just wondering, with you personally, whether there's any practices or anything that you do or you've implemented that can help others to have that action rather than reaction in terms of situations like this.
Good question, thank you. Could just hear one with the lady in the front here. That and then.
Thank you. It's a comment really to something you said about when you were being invited to go ahead with the restorative justice, and that actually James it wouldn't serve him, there was no advantage to him doing it. And that utterly horrified me, that lack of wisdom and advice. And so it's a comment really that left me feeling really quite despondent about the wisdom and the lack of understanding of the complete picture. So if you have a comment to that, but that's all I wanted to say really.
The second question around is there a still point, a transitional moment, a space, if you like, where something else might be just about imagined, or is that something that you recognise? Like how do you create the conditions for this journey to be as it is for you? Either of you?
Oh.
Yeah, not sure. That's a good start. Maybe not being sure about it is yeah.
Sure how you'd create a space.
Well, maybe reframe the question. What did you? Because I've got 3 questions in my head, and my memories. I've got 3-week-old baby and another one. So I've got you could call them, or service users. It is a really big issue. I don't know what the solution is to it, but I do see it time and time again. Professionals feeling, and it goes back to your comment, that they know best for the decisions that people should make with their lives. And it just, again, to reiterate your shock about that, it kind of baffles me, to be honest, to think that there are people with good intentions. I guess it's coming from a good place, but to limit what people can do and the conversations that people can have based on your own assumptions is it's not very good.
I want to give you both a chance to say anything else, a kind of last word if you want it, but I've got just a minute or two to collect any comments. We probably won't have time for questions and responses, but if any, yes, gentleman at the back. Is there anyone else want to? Yeah, so the mic is nearly with the gentleman here, so we'll just take that one. And if we could bring the... Yes, go ahead. That's great, I've got lots of suggestions. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Marina and all the panel, thank you so much for an extremely interesting evening. I just make one comment. I think it's incredible through restorative justice that an inhuman act can bring such humanity to the table. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And where's the mic gone? Whoever's got the mic, speak up.
Yes, I suppose it is a question, but it's also a comment. It's really to Marina. You talked about meaning making as being important in the process, your last. And I wondered, resting over all this, the religions of the world have caused a great deal of stuff that needs forgiving. I'm really interested in how far in the narratives you have spirituality is helpful and how far spirituality is actually a hindrance. Because I think there are probably examples of both. And I'm interested to see if it features in the stories at all.
Can I come to you with a last word in a moment, but just hear any final comments? Yes, gentleman here. Thank you.
I don't need it. You can hear me.
The mic's right next to you. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Finn. I'm a restorative justice practitioner, but I've taken it a step further, and we do it in forensic mental health. So I work with people who have committed offences whilst unwell, and looking at how we repair harm. But and a question, you've addressed two major questions that I face every day is how can I forgive myself, and also do I have to forgive the person? And I just wanted to make a comment that it's important, particularly for victims, I think, that they don't feel they have to forgive as part of this process, that the process is about telling a different story and getting answers and explanations that our system can't give us, but a human connection can. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see lots of hands. And let's people wanted to. My apologies that there isn't time to take any more comments from in this context, but please stay on and continue our conversations. Just before rounding up, I just wanted to give you a chance to have any final comment on this. You don't have to if you don't want to. But.
Well, I'd just like to thank Marina for having us. I think it's been an interesting evening for both of us.
Yeah. And instead of words, feel what you felt today, take it away, and deal with it.
Yes, and I want to say a huge thank you to you both for drawing down into words things that are not really speakable. They're more about an experience, and you're finding ways to open doors for us in and out of those experiences, and to the many storytellers that you've drawn our attention to. And particularly, I'd like to recall all of the people who we've lost, and through the impact that's had on their loved ones, that we inherit this kind of beauty from a very dark place. So I just like to acknowledge all of those people that we've lost. Marina,
final word?
There's something to be a final word, and also to say something about the Forgiveness Project as well.
Well, I'm just going to respond to the comment about spirituality, which is as difficult and complex a word, I think, as forgiveness. So all I will say about that is I used to describe the Forgiveness Project as grittily secular until Marion Partington, who's one of our storytellers, really took me to task. And she says, you're completely wrong, it isn't. And what I really meant is, there are lots of some religious stories, people who come from a point of religion, but many who don't. And she said every single story there has a spiritual line running through it, and I think she's right. And I think it's part of it, but I think it's difficult to talk about, and especially answer that kind of question now. But that's my response to the question.
Yeah, I think one of the gifts of the way that you've invented the Forgiveness Project is finding shall we say, a secular language for insights that are born from all sorts of religious and spiritual traditions, and are born from the horrors of what some of those traditions have visited on the world. And you're finding a way in which people of many, I imagine that people of many faiths in this room can meet and continue this conversation. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I have to say one other thing, which is my worst thing to say, and I always hate saying it, but I'm always made to say it. And you can imagine what it is. But really, the first thing is to thank you for your generosity, because you've all bought a ticket for coming here. But if you wanted to be even more generous, there is a text that you can use, or there's going to be buckets. And I also want to, because it's a hard charity. You can imagine what a hard charity this is to fundraise for. I mean, it's about changing minds and changing behaviour. So we rely on individuals always. We have an amazing supporters program. Some supporters are here who give monthly. If any of you are interested in that and becoming more connected with us, becoming part of this movement, you can find out about it on the website or come and see any of us afterwards. But I'm going to hand over to you now.
Sure,
and I want to also thank really Joan and Jacob so much for sharing their vulnerability, sharing their stories and coming here.
So just a couple of closing comments. For anyone affected by these stories and want to take this conversation further, you know about the web resources, but we also have a number of the trustees of the Forgiveness Project in the room, and those people are wearing badges, and there are other people who have training and experience in how to hold these conversations. So if you feel affected and want to have a discussion with someone, please do. And then it just remains for me to say a couple of thank yous, particularly to people you can't see here at the moment. Rachel Bird, the director of the Forgiveness Project. Sarah Smith, the project coordinator, for organising all of this. And just finally to say that there's a bookstall here, there's a bar, please stay. And just from me, I feel very moved and honoured really to be asked to help support the Forgiveness Project, which I've admired for many years, and I feel that I personally have gained and continue to gain a lot from. So thank you very much. Thank you.